Hello everyone, and welcome to my YNR Official 24 channel. Nikki NEWMAN, already fragile from weeks of emotional warfare, stood near the fireplace at the Abbott mansion, her hands trembling as she tried to steady herself, her eyes glassy with a mix of defiance and exhaustion, while Diane Jenkins, sharp-tongued and simmering with resentment, paced like a caged animal, every step echoing with old wounds that had never healed, and Jack Abbott, caught between past and present, loyalty and conscience, hovered helplessly, his jaw tight, his eyes darting between the two women as though he could somehow will the storm away, but storms don't listen. And when Diane's voice rose, dripping with accusation, accusing Nikki of poisoning Jack against her, of manipulating Victor, of rewriting history to make herself the eternal victim, Nikki snapped back with a venomous truth about Diane's endless schemes, about the bodies left behind in her climb back into Jack's life. And suddenly the air felt too thin to breathe, the words cutting deeper than knives. And then, before anyone could stop it, Diane struck a sharp, humiliating slap that rang out like a gunshot, the sound so loud it seemed to freeze time itself, Nikki's head whipping to the side as pain exploded across her face, her body stumbling backward, crashing into a table as gasps filled the room, shock rippling outward like a tidal wave, and in that split second Jack's instincts roared to life, overriding every doubt, every lingering affection, every complicated memory, because he saw Nikki not as Victor's wife, not as his longtime rival's partner, but as a woman being attacked, humiliated, hurt, and before Diane could even draw another breath, Jack moved, shoving Diane hard, his hands gripping her shoulders as he pushed her away from Nikki, sending her sprawling onto the floor in a tangle of fury and disbelief, the impact knocking the wind out of her as she stared up at him, stunned, while Jack stood over her, his voice thunderous, shaking with rage as he demanded she stop, demanded she leave, demanded she never lay a hand on Nikki again, and the room erupted into chaos as Nikki clutched her cheek, tears spilling freely now, not just from the pain of the slap but from the deeper ache of betrayal, humiliation, and exhaustion. Victor's name whispered on her lips as though invoking his strength from afar, while Diane scrambled to her feet, her pride wounded more deeply than her body, screaming that Jack had chosen Nikki, that he had always chosen Nikki, that history was repeating itself no matter how much she fought it, and Jack fired back that this wasn't about choosing sides, this was about decency, about drawing a line that should never have been crossed, his voice breaking as years of regret and self-reproach spilled out, admitting that he had enabled Diane for too long, had excused too much because of love, nostalgia, and hope, but watching her strike Nikki had snapped something inside him, had shown him a truth he could no longer ignore, and as Diane shouted that Nikki deserved it, that Nikki had destroyed lives just as much as she had, Jack roared that no one deserved violence, that no amount of history justified it, and Nikki, still shaking, found her voice at last, telling Diane with quiet devastation that this was exactly why she would always end up alone, because she confused control with love and cruelty with strength, the words landing like blows. And for a moment Diane looked genuinely shaken, her bravado cracking as she realized she had lost more than just her temper. She had lost Jack, truly and finally, and when security rushed in, drawn by the noise, Jack ordered them to escort Diane out, his hand never leaving Nikki's shoulder as though anchoring her to the present, protecting her from collapsing under the weight of it all, Diane screaming that this wasn't over, that Nikki would pay, that Jack would regret this. Her voice fading down the hallway as the door slammed shut, leaving behind a stunned silence broken only by Nikki's quiet sobs, Jack guiding her to the sofa, apologizing over and over for letting it get this far, for not stopping it sooner, for failing to protect everyone involved, and Nikki, pressing a trembling hand to his, whispered that she never expected him to defend her. Not like that. Not against Diane, and Jack confessed that in that moment he hadn't thought about alliances or vendettas or Victor. He had only seen a line crossed and a woman in pain, and outside, unseen but not uninvolved, The consequences were already beginning to ripple through Genoa City like a shockwave, because word of the slap spread fast, igniting old feuds and forging new ones. Victor NEWMAN's fury would be legendary when he learned someone had struck his wife. Ashley Abbott would question Jack's judgment even as she supported his moral stand. Phyllis would weaponize the chaos for her own ends. Kyle would be forced to confront the reality of his mother's actions, and Nikki herself would be forever changed. By the moment Jack Abbott stepped between her and Diane Jenkins, because that single shove, that single act of protection, rewrote loyalties and redrew battle lines, turning whispers into wars and emotions into weapons, proving once again that in Genoa City, the most shocking blows aren't always the ones that land on the skin, but the ones that strike the heart. And as Nikki sat there, cheek burning, heart aching, she knew this wasn't just a slap. It was the spark that would set the city on fire. And as the echoes of Diane's furious exit continued to reverberate through the Abbott mansion, the emotional fallout only deepened, because what had happened was not a single moment frozen in time, but a fracture that split open decades of resentment, loyalty, and unspoken truth. And Nikki, still seated on the sofa with Jack beside her, felt the full weight of it pressing down on her chest, as though the slap had awakened every unresolved battle she had ever fought in Genoa City. Her fingers trembling uncontrollably as she tried to compose herself, her pride warring with her vulnerability, while Jack hovered close, his protective stance unwavering, his hand offering silent reassurance even as his own mind raced with the realization that he had just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, because pushing Diane away, physically, emotionally, definitively, meant acknowledging that the woman he had once loved, the woman he had tried to redeem, was capable of cruelty he could no longer excuse. And Nikki, sensing the turmoil inside him, finally spoke again, her voice hoarse but steady, telling him he didn't have to stay, that she could manage, that she had endured worse than a slap. But Jack shook his head fiercely, insisting that this mattered, that it mattered because no one should ever feel unsafe, especially not in a place that once symbolized family. And those words cut Nikki deeper than any insult, because safety had become such a rare commodity in her life, constantly under siege by enemies, schemes, and betrayals. And for a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to lean into Jack's presence, not romantically, not strategically, but humanly, as two people bound by years of shared history and mutual scars sat together in the aftermath of violence. And yet, even in that fragile calm, the storm was far from over, because elsewhere in the mansion Ashley Abbott stood frozen in the doorway, having arrived just in time to witness Diane being dragged out, her eyes wide with disbelief and concern as she took in the sight of Nikki's flushed cheek and Jack's rigid posture. And Ashley's mind immediately went to war, torn between her distrust of Diane, her complicated feelings toward Nikki, and her protective instincts toward her brother. And when she finally spoke, her voice was sharp with urgency, demanding to know exactly what had happened, demanding to know how things had escalated so badly. And as Jack recounted the confrontation, the accusations, the slap, Ashley's face hardened, not in shock but in grim recognition, because she had always known Diane was volatile beneath the polished exterior, always suspected that her desperation to reclaim her place in Jack's life would eventually tip into something darker. And yet, hearing it confirmed, seeing the consequences written on Nikki's face, made the situation horrifyingly real. And Ashley declared flatly that Diane had gone too far this time, that there would be consequences, legal and otherwise. Words that made Nikki stiffen, because she didn't want pity or retribution. She wanted dignity. She wanted control over her own narrative, and she insisted that this wasn't about revenge, but about boundaries. About making it clear that violence would not be tolerated. And Jack nodded, agreeing, though he knew Victor NEWMAN would never see it so calmly, and almost as if summoned by the mere thought of his name. Nikki's phone buzzed insistently on the table, Victor's name flashing across the screen like a warning light, and the room seemed to hold its breath as Nikki stared at it, knowing that once she answered, nothing would ever be simple again, because Victor's love was fierce and consuming, and his response to anyone hurting her would be ruthless. And when Nikki finally answered, her voice was soft but controlled, assuring him she was safe, that she was with Jack, that Diane had lashed out, and the silence on the other end was chilling, Victor absorbing every word, every implication, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low and dangerous, promising that Diane Jenkins would regret laying a hand on his wife, promising consequences that went far beyond apologies, and Nikki closed her eyes, torn between gratitude and dread, because she knew Victor's protection often came at a price, and Jack, listening to only half the conversation, already understood that his decision to protect Nikki had now placed him squarely in the center of a war he hadn't intended to fight, because Victor NEWMAN would see this as both an insult and an opportunity, and as Nikki ended the call, she warned Jack quietly that Victor would not let this go, and Jack replied just as quietly that neither would he, because this wasn't about power plays anymore, it was about standing up for what was right, words that surprised even himself, because for so long he had allowed shades of gray to blur his moral compass, especially where Diane was concerned, and now, with brutal clarity, he saw that defending her had cost him his integrity, and that realization burned, and meanwhile, across town, Diane sat alone in her car, hands shaking violently on the steering wheel, tears of rage streaming down her face. As she replayed the moment Jack shoved her, the look of disgust and disappointment in his eyes searing into her soul, because that look hurt far more than the fall, and Diane's mind spiraled with justification and denial, convincing herself that Nikki had provoked her, that Nikki had deserved the slap, that Jack had betrayed her, and yet beneath all that fury was a gnawing fear that this time she had truly destroyed any chance of redemption, that she had exposed the very darkness she had worked so hard to hide, and as she sped away from the mansion, her phone began to light up with messages she ignored, because she knew the fallout was already spreading, and back at the Abbott house, the evening dissolved into damage control, security statements, whispered conversations, and unspoken questions, Kyle arriving late and sensing immediately that something was terribly wrong. His confusion turning to horror as he learned what his mother had done, his loyalty warring with his conscience. His voice cracking as he asked Jack if it was true, if Diane had really struck Nikki, and Jack's solemn nod felt like a verdict, forcing Kyle to confront a reality he had tried desperately to avoid, that his mother's past wasn't just haunting her, it was actively shaping her present, and Nikki, seeing Kyle's devastation, surprised everyone by offering him compassion, telling him gently that this wasn't his fault, that children should never bear the weight of their parents' sins, words that left Kyle shaken and grateful, even as guilt twisted inside him, and as the night wore on, Genoa City buzzed with rumors, speculation, and shock, alliances shifting as quickly as headlines, because the image of Jack Abbott physically intervening to protect Nikki NEWMAN was seismic, challenging long-held assumptions about loyalty and rivalry, and Phyllis Summers, upon hearing the news, couldn't decide whether to be outraged, amused, or opportunistic, already calculating how this new fracture could be exploited, while Ashley quietly began preparing for the legal and corporate implications, knowing Diane would not go quietly, and through it all, Nikki returned home later that night, her cheeks still tender, her spirit bruised but unbroken, Victor greeting her with controlled fury and fierce tenderness, vowing that no one would ever hurt her again, and Nikki, resting her head against his chest, wondered whether that vow would protect her or ignite yet another war, because in Genoa City, protection and destruction were often two sides of the same coin, and as she closed her eyes, the image of Jack stepping forward, of Diane falling back, of the sound of that slap echoing endlessly, replayed in her mind, not as a moment of weakness, but as a turning point, a moment when lines were drawn and illusions shattered, and she knew with absolute certainty that nothing would ever be the same again, because one shocking slap had exposed the truth beneath the masks, and the fallout had only just begun. By morning, the shock of the night before had hardened into something colder and more dangerous, because Genoa City never let wounds heal quietly, and Nikki woke with a dull ache spreading from her cheek into her temples, a physical reminder of the emotional violence that refused to fade, and as she stood before the mirror, touching the faint discoloration beneath her eye, she wasn't just seeing Diane's handprint. She was seeing every battle she had survived, every time she had been underestimated, dismissed, or attacked for standing her ground. And yet this time felt different, heavier, because it hadn't happened in the shadows or behind closed doors, but in the heart of the Abbott home, witnessed, undeniable, impossible to spin away. And when Victor entered the room, his expression dark and controlled, Nikki knew he had already begun moving pieces into place. Because Victor NEWMAN never waited for permission to strike back, and as he promised again that Diane would face consequences, Nikki surprised him by asking him to wait, by insisting that this had to be handled carefully, that retaliation would only feed Diane's narrative of victimhood, and Victor, unused to being restrained where Nikki's safety was concerned, studied her intently, recognizing the steel beneath her calm, realizing that this wasn't weakness but strategy, and though he didn't fully agree, he nodded, if only temporarily, because even Victor could sense that this moment required something more calculated than brute force. And across town, Jack sat alone in his office, replaying the confrontation again and again, the memory of his hands on Diane's shoulders, the shock in her eyes, the unmistakable finality of it all, and he felt a deep, aching grief settle in his chest, mourning not just the relationship he had lost but the illusion he had clung to, the belief that love and patience could fix everything. And Ashley's earlier words echoed in his mind, reminding him that enabling was not compassion, that silence was not neutrality, and as Jack resolved to stand firm no matter the fallout, he knew this decision would cost him, personally and professionally, but for the first time in a long while, he felt certain he was doing the right thing, and that certainty mattered. Even as whispers began circulating through Jabot, through NEWMAN Enterprises, through every corner of their interconnected world, because Diane Jenkins striking Nikki NEWMAN was the kind of scandal that fed on itself, and no amount of damage control could contain it. And Diane, now holed up in her apartment, watched the news scroll across her phone, headlines skewed and sensationalized, her name dragged through the mud, her anger slowly curdling into something sharper, more focused, because Diane had never been one to accept defeat quietly, and though she knew she had crossed a line, she also believed the world was conspiring against her, rewriting the story to paint her as a monster, and that belief fueled her resolve to fight back, to reclaim control by any means necessary, even as Kyle tried desperately to reach her, torn between love and accountability, his unanswered calls a silent indictment, and when he finally showed up at her door, demanding answers, demanding to know why, Diane's defenses crumbled just long enough to reveal the fear beneath, her tearful insistence that Nikki had pushed her too far, that everyone was against her, that Jack had chosen sides without listening, and Kyle, though sympathetic, couldn't ignore the truth staring him in the face, telling her gently but firmly that nothing justified violence, that this wasn't the way to protect herself or him. And those words hurt Diane almost as much as Jack's rejection, because they confirmed what she feared most, that she was losing her son too. And as Kyle left, heart heavy, Diane sat alone with the consequences of her actions, realizing that for the first time, there might not be a way to spin her way out. And back at the NEWMAN ranch, Nikki hosted a small, carefully chosen gathering, not to celebrate but to reclaim her power, surrounded by allies who listened as she spoke openly about what had happened, refusing to be shamed into silence. And Jack's presence there sent a clear message, one that rippled outward with unmistakable force, because his public support of Nikki was not just personal, it was symbolic, signaling a shift that no one could ignore. And as the evening unfolded, conversations turned to what this meant for the future, for alliances long taken for granted, and Nikki, though grateful, felt the weight of leadership settle on her shoulders, knowing that how she handled this would define not just her reputation but the tone of the battles to come. And later, alone again, she allowed herself a moment of vulnerability, wondering if the slap would always linger, not as pain but as a reminder of how quickly civility could crumble. And yet she also recognized the strange clarity it had brought, stripping away pretenses and forcing people to reveal who they truly were. And in that clarity, Nikki found resolve, because she